A 5-second question cost Emma Carter her job. In front of a room filled with wealthy investors and business leaders, the young waitress interrupted a luxury wine presentation and challenged a claim nobody else dared question. Everyone assumed she had just ruined one of the most important dinners Aurelia had ever hosted. Nobody understood why a waitress would risk her career to question a nationally respected wine expert. And nobody knew that 5 minutes after she was fired, the French billionaire investor everyone had been waiting for would walk into the room and ask a question that changed everything. Where is Emma Carter? Earlier that afternoon, Emma had helped process a stack of incoming documentation from several private collectors and storage facilities. Most employees would have signed the paperwork without a second thought. Emma never did. Years of reviewing authentication records had trained her eyes to notice details others overlooked. One document in particular had caught her attention. It referenced the exact Bordeaux bottle scheduled to be presented that evening. The name attached to the transfer record was Lambert Collection. At the time, Emma filed the information away and returned to work. Hours later, standing quietly near the back of the private dining room, she listened as the sommelier began introducing the centerpiece of the meal. Grant Walker watched with satisfaction. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. Then the sommelier confidently addressed the room. This extraordinary Bordeaux has remained within the Delacroix collection and its certified storage chain since its acquisition 18 months ago. Emma looked up immediately. She had just heard the same bottle connected to two completely different ownership histories. The sommelier continued speaking, unaware of the growing concern on her face. Emma replayed the transfer document in her mind. Lambert Collection. The presentation claimed Delacroix Collection. Both histories could not be correct. Her stomach tightened. Around her sat investors capable of committing millions of dollars based on the credibility of Aurelia's expertise. If the provenance was being presented incorrectly, the bottle's value and authenticity would immediately come under scrutiny. Emma hesitated. The man speaking was a nationally recognized wine expert. She was a waitress. Every instinct told her to remain silent. But another part of her knew exactly how expensive a provenance mistake could become. Taking a slow breath, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir." The room instantly fell silent. The sommelier frowned. Grant turned sharply toward her. Emma kept her voice respectful. "I may be mistaken, but could you clarify something for me?" The sommelier's expression hardened. "What exactly?" Emma glanced toward the bottle. "You mentioned this Bordeaux remained within the Delacroix collection. Earlier today, I reviewed a transfer document that appeared to associate the bottle with the Lambert collection. Could you help me understand the discrepancy?" The sommelier offered a thin smile, the kind professionals use when they believe a discussion has already been settled. "There is no discrepancy," he said calmly. "The provenance documentation for this Bordeaux has been fully authenticated." Several guests nodded immediately. The answer sounded confident. Final, the kind of answer people expected from a nationally recognized wine expert. Emma remained respectful. "The transfer record I reviewed this afternoon listed the Lambert collection," she said. "That is why I was hoping for clarification." The sommelier folded his hands behind his back. "Miss Carter, with all due respect, you reviewed a routine transfer document. I reviewed the complete authentication package." A few executives exchanged amused glances. One investor quietly chuckled. The implication was obvious. A waitress was attempting to debate a specialist in front of a room full of wealthy guests. Grant Walker felt irritation building in his chest. The evening had been planned for weeks. Every detail had been carefully coordinated. Bernard Laurent had not even arrived yet, and already the presentation was being interrupted by a server questioning one of the industry's most respected experts. Emma sensed the growing tension but refused to back away. "I understand that," she said. "Carefully, I am not questioning your expertise. I am only asking why the ownership history appears different." The room grew noticeably quieter. The sommelier's expression hardened. Because provenance analysis requires context. Looking at a single document without understanding the entire chain of custody often leads to incorrect conclusions. Several guests nodded again. That explanation sounded reasonable. Emma knew it sounded reasonable because she had heard similar arguments years ago. It was often the first response people gave when they did not want uncomfortable questions examined too closely. "Then perhaps there is a simple explanation," she said. "I would just like to understand it." The sommelier took a slow breath. His patience was visibly fading. The explanation is that the bottle belongs to the Delacroix collection. The authentication package confirms it. There is nothing more to discuss. Murmurs spread across the room. Grant could feel the attention of every investor shifting away from the presentation and toward the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of distraction he had spent weeks trying to avoid. Emma glanced toward the bottle again. Something still felt wrong. The transfer document had been clear. She remembered the name because it had caught her attention immediately. Lambert Collection, not Delacroix. Both histories could not be correct. "Sir," she said quietly, "if there is an error in the provenance records, that is enough." Grant's voice cut through the room like a knife. Silence followed instantly. Emma turned toward him. Grant stepped forward, his expression cold and controlled. "This presentation is not the place for this discussion." "I understand," Emma replied. "But if there is a documentation issue, it could affect." "I said enough." The firmness in his voice left no room for argument. Emma stopped speaking. Around the room, nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be caught between a billionaire CEO and a server who had clearly overstepped her place. Grant looked directly at her. "You are disrupting an event attended by some of the most important people associated with this company." Emma lowered her eyes briefly. "That was never my intention." "Intentions are irrelevant. Professional boundaries exist for a reason." The words landed heavily. Emma realized exactly where this was heading. Grant continued, "If you cannot respect those boundaries, then you no longer work here." A stunned silence filled the private dining room. Even the sommelier looked slightly surprised by how quickly the situation had escalated. Emma stood motionless for several seconds. Then, without anger or protest, she slowly removed her name tag and placed it on a nearby table. Nobody expected her to leave so calmly. Before turning away, she looked once toward Grant and then toward the bottle. "For Aurelia's sake," she said softly, "I hope the documents are wrong." Then she walked toward the exit. The heavy doors closed behind her. Grant exhaled slowly and straightened his jacket. "My apologies, everyone," he said. "Let's continue." The sommelier resumed his presentation. Conversation cautiously returned. The tension began to fade. 5 minutes later, the private dining room doors opened again. Every head turned. An older man entered accompanied by several advisors. The room instantly recognized him. Bernard Laurent had finally arrived. Grant stepped forward with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Laurent, we're honored." Bernard barely looked at him. His eyes swept across the room, searching. Then his expression changed. "Where is Emma Carter?" For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The room seemed frozen between confusion and disbelief. Grant Walker stared at Bernard Laurent, convinced he had misheard him. Of all the people the French billionaire investor could have asked about upon entering Aurelia, he had asked for a waitress who had been fired less than 5 minutes earlier. "I'm sorry," Grant said carefully. "Who exactly are you looking for?" Bernard's expression remained unchanged. "Emma Carter." The room grew noticeably colder. Bernard slowly scanned the staff standing along the walls as if expecting to see her somewhere among them. "She was scheduled to be working tonight," he said. "Where is she?" Grant felt an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. "There was an incident during the presentation," he explained. "She is no longer employed here." Bernard's eyes shifted toward him. "You fired her?" The question was calm. That somehow made it worse. Grant nodded. "She interrupted the presentation and challenged our sommelier in front of guests." Bernard was silent for several moments. Then he asked a single question. "What exactly did she say?" Nobody seemed eager to answer. Finally, Grant repeated the exchange as accurately as he could remember. He explained how Emma had questioned the ownership history of the Bordeaux and referenced a transfer document connected to the Lambert collection. Bernard listened without interruption. As Grant spoke, the French investor's face became increasingly difficult to read. When the explanation ended, Bernard looked toward the display table. "So she did not accuse anyone of fraud?" "No," Grant admitted. "She simply questioned the provenance history." Bernard nodded slowly. "And what explanation was given?" The sommelier stepped forward confidently. "The authentication package confirms the bottle belongs to the Delacroix collection." Bernard turned toward him. "Does it?" The confidence in the room seemed to weaken slightly. Bernard approached the display table and picked up the presentation folder. Rather than examining the bottle itself, he immediately began reviewing the accompanying documentation. Page after page turned beneath his fingers. The room remained silent except for the sound of paper moving. Finally, Bernard stopped. His eyes settled on a particular page. Then he looked up. "Where is the supplemental transfer record?" The sommelier frowned. "I'm not sure what you mean." Bernard lifted one document from the folder. "This authentication package references a supplemental ownership transfer filed 3 months ago." The sommelier stepped closer. "That document wasn't included in the presentation materials." Bernard's gaze sharpened. "Exactly." Several investors exchanged uneasy looks. Grant suddenly felt his pulse quicken. Bernard continued reading. "The primary ownership history references Delacroix collection. The supplemental record references Lambert collection. The discrepancy Emma identified is real." Silence crashed across the room. The sommelier's face lost color. "That doesn't necessarily mean the provenance is invalid," he argued. Bernard nodded. "Correct." Then he closed the folder. "But it absolutely means the provenance is incomplete." Nobody spoke. Bernard placed the folder on the table. "The bottle itself may be perfectly legitimate. The ownership history may ultimately be resolved. But before presenting a collectible asset of this value to investors, every inconsistency should have been investigated." He paused. Emma Carter was the only person in this room who recognized that. Grant felt a growing sense of dread. He remembered Emma's tone. She had not accused anyone of deception. She had not claimed the bottle was fake. She had simply asked a question nobody else had bothered to ask. Bernard looked directly at Grant. "The waitress did not embarrass your company tonight." The words landed like a hammer. "She protected it." Nobody dared look at Grant. Bernard slowly returned the folder to the table. "If I had discovered this discrepancy myself during the investment review, my first conclusion would have been that Aurelia's verification process could not be trusted." The implication was devastating. Millions of dollars suddenly felt far less secure than they had an hour earlier. Grant swallowed hard. He began wondering whether Emma had been trying to save him from a mistake he never saw coming. Bernard folded his hands behind his back and studied Grant for a long moment. Then he asked a question far more dangerous than the first one. "Do you have any idea who Emma Carter really is?" The room fell silent once again. Grant stared back at him, confused. "She's a waitress," he answered. Bernard's faint smile contained more disappointment than amusement. "No, Grant." His eyes drifted toward the closed doors through which Emma had disappeared only minutes earlier. "That is merely where she works. It is not who she is." Grant stared at Bernard Laurent in complete confusion. Around them, the room that had spent the evening discussing investments and expansion plans was now focused entirely on a waitress who had already left the building. "If she's not a waitress, then who is she?" one executive finally asked. Bernard remained silent for a moment before slowly walking back toward the presentation table. 5 years ago, he began. One of the largest wine authentication investigations in Europe uncovered irregularities that prevented millions of dollars in counterfeit luxury assets from entering private auctions. Several guests immediately recognized the case. Even Grant had heard of it. It had become a landmark example of authentication fraud. "Most people remember the specialist who received credit for exposing the scheme," Bernard continued. "His name was Victor Moreau." The sommelier nodded immediately. "Of course. Everyone in the industry knows Moreau." Bernard's expression darkened slightly. "That is precisely the problem." The room fell quiet. Bernard looked directly at Grant. "Because Victor Moreau was not the person who discovered the inconsistencies." Confused murmurs spread among the investors. Bernard reached into his jacket and removed his phone. After a few moments, he placed it on the table and turned the screen toward them. The photograph showed a younger Emma standing beside a team of authentication analysts inside a research facility. She looked confident, professional, and completely different from the quiet waitress everyone thought they knew. Several guests leaned closer. Grant felt his stomach tighten. There was no mistaking her face. That investigation began when a junior analyst noticed inconsistencies in a chain of custody report that every senior specialist had approved, Bernard said. The analyst repeatedly raised concerns. She was ignored. Then she proved she was right. Bernard tapped the image lightly. That analyst was Emma Carter. She had traveled from Chicago to France as part of an elite international authentication program. At the time, Emma was not the person anyone expected to uncover a major fraud. She was a trainee working beneath some of the industry's most experienced analysts. The room erupted with disbelief. The sommelier stared at the screen in shock. You're saying she worked in authentication? Bernard nodded slowly. I worked on that investigation alongside Emma, Bernard said quietly. She was one of the junior trainees on the project, and many of us quickly realized she had noticed something the rest of us had missed. Unfortunately, she wasn't the person signing the final reports. Bernard paused. By the time those reports were published, the story looked very different. I told myself there was nothing I could do. For years, I regretted that decision. Grant looked back at the photograph. Suddenly, Emma's calm persistence earlier that evening made far more sense. She hadn't challenged the presentation because she wanted attention. She had challenged it because she recognized a warning sign. Bernard continued. The investigation ultimately exposed major fraud. Millions were protected. Careers were made. His voice hardened. Unfortunately, not all of the right careers. One investor frowned. What happened? Bernard exhaled slowly. The official reports credited Victor Morrow. Internal revisions gradually erased Emma's contribution. The paper trail changed. Recognition disappeared. By the time questions were raised, the industry had already accepted a different version of events. Grant felt increasingly uncomfortable. The story sounded disturbingly familiar. A talented person identifies a problem. Authority figures dismiss the warning. Someone else receives the benefit. Bernard looked toward the closed doors again. Most people would have fought publicly. Emma chose a different path. She left the industry entirely and disappeared from public view. Bernard said. Grant remembered Emma's face when he fired her. There had been no outrage, no panic, no desperate attempt to keep her job, only disappointment. Now he finally understood why. Bernard slipped his phone back into his pocket. I never forgot what happened after that investigation, Bernard said quietly. For years, I wondered what became of the young trainee who had the courage to ask questions nobody else wanted to ask. His eyes settled on Grant. Tonight, the first thing she did when she spotted another inconsistency was try to protect your company. Grant lowered his gaze. Bernard's final words landed harder than anything else he had said that evening. And tonight, you made the same mistake they did. The private dining room remained unusually quiet long after Bernard Laurent finished speaking. The prestigious dinner that had been carefully planned for months had completely lost its original purpose. Nobody was talking about expansion strategies anymore. Nobody seemed interested in investment projections. The only topic that mattered now was Emma Carter. Grant Walker stood near the presentation table, staring at the folder containing the disputed provenance documents, and he found himself replaying the confrontation from the beginning. Emma had never accused anyone of fraud. She had never tried to embarrass the sommelier. She had simply asked a question that nobody in the room had been able to answer. Bernard eventually gathered the documents into a neat stack. The ownership discrepancy must be investigated before any further presentation takes place, he said calmly. Until then, I consider this matter unresolved. No one argued. The investors had seen enough. One by one, conversations faded into smaller private discussions. Grant barely noticed. His thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Hours later, after the guests had left and the restaurant had fallen silent, Grant sat alone in his office. Emma's personnel file lay open on his desk. What began as simple curiosity quickly turned into confusion. Her performance reviews were exceptional. Her attendance record was nearly flawless. Managers repeatedly described her as detail-oriented, reliable, and unusually observant. Yet nowhere in the file was there any mention of her previous career. No mention of authentication. No mention of the investigation Bernard had described. It was as though an entire chapter of her life had been deliberately erased. Grant leaned back in his chair. The image Bernard had shown earlier returned to his mind. The confident young analyst standing proudly beside industry experts looked nothing like the quiet waitress he thought he knew. Or perhaps she had been exactly the same person all along, and he had simply never bothered to look closely enough. Across the city, Emma sat alone inside a small 24-hour coffee shop. Her folded Aurelia uniform rested beside her on the empty chair. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. She stared into a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Losing the job hurt. Not because she loved waitressing. Not because she needed Aurelia. What hurt was the familiarity of it. She had learned long ago that telling the truth did not guarantee anyone would listen. Tonight, she had done the same thing. The result felt painfully similar. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly on the table. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Emma hesitated before opening the message. Attached was a scanned document. Her eyes widened instantly. It was part of the original authentication archive tied to the investigation. She zoomed in on the page. Hidden beneath later revisions and edited signatures was a name she had not seen in years. Her own. Emma's pulse quickened. A second message appeared moments later. This one contained only a single sentence. Bernard gave me access to the archived records tonight. It took hours of recovery work and assistance from independent investigators, but I think we found something that never should have disappeared. The message was signed simply, Grant Walker. Emma stared at the screen. For years, she had believed the evidence was gone forever. Buried. Altered. Forgotten. Yet now, sitting alone in the quiet coffee shop, she found herself looking at proof that the truth might still exist after all. After 5 years, Emma found herself considering a possibility she thought she had left behind forever. Maybe her story was not over yet. Emma barely slept that night. The scanned archive page remained open on her phone long after she returned home. For years, she had convinced herself the past was finished. The reports had been altered. The credit had been reassigned. The industry had moved on. Eventually, she had done the same. Or at least she thought she had. Yet now, a single recovered document was threatening to reopen everything she had spent 5 years trying to bury. The following afternoon, as Emma stepped out of her apartment building carrying a bag of groceries, she immediately noticed a familiar black sedan parked. Across the street, Grant Walker stood beside it. Gone was the perfectly tailored executive image he projected inside Aurelia. Today he looked tired. The kind of tired that came from realizing something important about yourself and not liking what you found. Emma stopped walking. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Grant broke the silence. I wasn't sure you'd be willing to see me. Emma folded her arms. I'm not sure I am. Grant nodded. Fair enough. To his credit, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't hide behind corporate language. I came to apologize. Emma studied him carefully. She had heard apologies before. Most of them were designed to protect the person giving them. For firing me, she asked. For not listening, Grant answered. The honesty surprised her. Grant looked away briefly before continuing. The firing was just the final mistake. The real mistake happened earlier. Emma remained silent. You asked a reasonable question, he said. I didn't evaluate the question. I evaluated the person asking it. The words landed harder than he intended. Because they were true. Emma looked down at the sidewalk. Most people do. Grant felt a wave of guilt. Bernard's story suddenly made even more sense. People overlooked Emma because they focused on her title instead of her insight. Last night, he ignored her because she was a waitress. Different circumstances. Same outcome. They eventually crossed the street and sat inside a small coffee shop near her apartment. Nothing about the place resembled Aurelia. There were no investors. No luxury decor. No executives competing for status. Just ordinary people having ordinary conversations. For the first time, Grant and Emma were speaking as equals. Bernard told me what happened with Victor Moreau, Grant said. Emma gave a faint smile. I'm sure he told you the version that makes me sound impressive. The documents do that on their own. Emma looked away. The documents didn't stop any of it from happening. A brief silence settled between them. Grant understood what she meant. Evidence alone wasn't enough when powerful people controlled the narrative. The archive records we recovered are substantial, he said. Much more than that single page I sent you. Emma turned back toward him. How much more? Grant slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of recovered emails, timestamp records, revision histories, and internal approval logs. Emma's eyes widened with every page. The evidence was far stronger than she had imagined. This shouldn't exist anymore, she whispered. I know. She continued reading. Years of doubt, frustration, and disappointment collided inside her chest. She wasn't relying on memory. The records, the truth was there. Undeniable. Finally, she closed the folder. Grant watched her carefully. What are you going to do? Emma looked out the window. For 5 years, she would have answered that question immediately. Walk away. Move on. Protect herself. But now she wasn't so sure. I honestly don't know, she admitted. Grant nodded. Whatever you decide, you deserve the chance to make that decision with the truth in front of you. Emma looked back at him. The arrogance she had come to expect was gone. And as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the cafe windows, Both of them realized something had quietly changed. The conversation was no longer about a bottle of wine. It was about whether a stolen truth could finally find its way home. Before leaving the cafe, Grant mentioned that Bernard wanted to speak with her personally. Emma made no promises. For the next 2 days, Emma barely touched the archive folder. It sat unopened on her kitchen table, a silent reminder of a chapter she had spent years trying to leave behind. Every time she looked at it, she felt the same conflict. The evidence mattered. The truth mattered. But reopening old wounds carried a cost she wasn't sure she wanted to pay. On the third morning, Emma finally agreed to Bernard's invitation. She wasn't looking for advice. She wasn't looking for validation. But after 2 days of staring at the evidence, she realized she could no longer avoid the conversation. 2 hours later, they sat overlooking Lake Michigan inside a quiet private dining room. Unlike the chaos of Aurelia, the atmosphere here was calm. Bernard listened, as Emma described her doubts. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You are not afraid of Victor Moreau," he said. "You are afraid of being disappointed again." Emma looked down at her coffee. The accuracy of the statement stung. Bernard continued. "What happened back then convinced you that integrity was not enough. The danger now is that you start believing they were right." For several moments, Emma said nothing. Then Bernard slid a leather portfolio across the table. "What is this?" she asked. "An opportunity." Emma opened the folder. Inside was a formal offer from one of Europe's largest wine investment groups. The position involved international authentication oversight, provenance investigations, and executive consulting. The compensation package was extraordinary. Emma immediately recognized that it would change her financial future overnight. Bernard watched her reaction carefully. "You were in that position years ago." Emma closed the folder. "And if I accept? Then you start over somewhere that actually values your expertise." The offer was tempting, more tempting than she wanted to admit. Yet something inside her remained unsettled. Later that evening, another message arrived, this time from Grant Walker. It was brief. "Would you be willing to visit Aurelia one last time? There is something I need to show you." Emma nearly declined. Instead, curiosity won. An hour later, she returned to Aurelia. Just days earlier, she had left through those same doors believing she would never come back. The restaurant looked exactly the same. Yet the atmosphere felt different. As she passed the open kitchen, she noticed something unusual. A young employee was explaining a supply discrepancy to a manager. Instead of being dismissed, the manager listened carefully and took notes. Nearby supervisors were doing the same. No one was being interrupted. No one was being intimidated into silence. Grant met her near the main dining room. "Come with me." He led her upstairs to a private conference room overlooking the restaurant. A single document rested on the table. Emma frowned. "What is this?" "Read it." She picked up the folder. The title immediately caught her attention. Director of Quality and Corporate Integrity. Emma looked up in disbelief. Grant remained serious. "This isn't charity. And it isn't an apology disguised as a promotion." Grant paused. "Before putting this proposal together, I asked Bernard Laurent, several independent auditors, and Aurelia's board to review your credentials, your prior work, and the recovered archive records. Every one of them reached the same conclusion. The board unanimously approved this recommendation." He looked directly at her. "You are more qualified for this role than anyone we could bring in from outside." He stepped toward the window, overlooking the staff below. "The more I reviewed what happened with you, the more I realized the problem wasn't a single mistake. It was the culture that allowed that mistake to happen." Emma remained silent. Grant continued. "People inside Aurelia learned that titles mattered more than truth. Last week proved how dangerous that mindset can be." He turned back toward her. "I built part of that culture. Now I want to fix it." Emma looked again at the proposal in her hands. One offer represented a fresh start in Europe. The other represented an opportunity to change the very system that had failed her. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Grant asked the question neither of them could avoid. "If you had the power to make sure what happened to you never happened to anyone else here again, would you take it?" In the weeks that followed, Bernard Laurent did exactly what he had promised. Armed with the recovered archive records, revision histories, internal communications, and authentication logs provided through the investigation, he returned to France and formally requested an independent review of the case that had altered Emma Carter's life 5 years earlier. What began as a private inquiry quickly expanded into something much larger. The volume of recovered documentation was impossible to ignore. Several organizations involved in wine authentication, luxury asset verification, and professional ethics agreed to examine the evidence. The original records were reviewed alongside the revisions that had followed. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the picture became. Timestamp records confirmed that Emma's findings had been submitted before the conclusions later credited to Victor Moreau. Internal correspondence revealed repeated discussions about attribution. Revision histories documented how references to Emma's work gradually disappeared from official reports. None of the evidence alone told the entire story. Together, it painted a picture that could no longer be explained away as oversight or coincidence. Within weeks, a formal ethics council convened in Paris to review the findings. Emma was not required to attend. Bernard never asked her to relive that experience. Instead, he focused on ensuring the evidence spoke for itself. The council's conclusions were decisive. The investigation determined that Emma Carter had been the original analyst responsible for identifying the discrepancies that launched the landmark authentication case. The findings further concluded that her contribution had not been properly acknowledged in the official record. News of the ruling spread quickly across the industry. Financial publications, trade journals, and professional organizations began reporting the story. For many readers, it was the first time they had ever heard Emma's name. For others, it was the first time they realized the version of events they had accepted for years was incomplete. The consequences arrived just as quickly. Victor Moreau was suspended from multiple professional organizations pending disciplinary review. Several consulting contracts were terminated. Speaking engagements were quietly canceled. Invitations that once arrived automatically stopped appearing. The reputation he had spent years building began to unravel under the weight of questions that could no longer be ignored. Thousands of miles away in Chicago, Emma sat alone at her kitchen table when her phone vibrated. A message from Bernard appeared on the screen. Attached was a photograph of the front page of one of France's largest financial newspapers. Emma opened it slowly. Her eyes moved across the headline and then stopped. Beneath it was a detailed summary of the council's findings. The public record had finally been corrected. Her name appeared exactly where it should have been all along. Emma stared at the article for several moments before continuing. Near the end, she found the sentence that affected her most. The council formally recognized her as the analyst whose work had initiated the investigation. No revision, no omission, no substitute name, just the truth. A second message arrived from Bernard a few moments later. The record has finally been corrected. Emma smiled faintly. Then another message appeared. My offer still stands. This time, I hope your decision is based on your future, not your past. Emma looked across the table. Bernard's proposal rested beside the folder Grant Walker had given her only days earlier. Europe offered a fresh beginning. Aurelia offered a chance to change something broken. Outside her apartment window, the city lights stretched across the Chicago skyline. Inside, two futures waited quietly in front of her. Neither fear nor disappointment stood between them. Only a choice. Several weeks after the ethics ruling in France, the headlines gradually began to fade. Industry publications moved on to newer stories. The debate surrounding the case slowly disappeared from public attention. For Emma Carter, however, the most important changes were only beginning. On a quiet Monday morning, Emma stepped through the front doors of Aurelia once again. This time, she wasn't wearing a server's uniform. She wasn't carrying a tray. She wasn't standing silently at the edge of someone else's conversation. She had accepted Grant Walker's offer and officially begun her role as Director of Quality and Corporate Integrity. The decision had surprised many people, including Bernard Laurent. The European position would have been easier, more prestigious, more lucrative. But after weeks of reflection, Emma realized something important. Leaving would improve her own future. Staying might improve the future of hundreds of people. Grant met her in the lobby and handed her a cup of coffee. Ready for your first day? He asked. Emma smiled. Ask me again in 6 months. The first few weeks were anything but easy. Some managers welcomed the changes. Others quietly resisted them. One of the earliest internal reviews focused on the provenance incident that had started everything. The review ultimately cleared the sommelier of intentional wrongdoing, concluding that he had relied on incomplete presentation materials and failed to independently verify a critical discrepancy before presenting it to investors. Rather than terminating him, Aurelia required every senior manager, consultant, and specialist including the sommelier, to complete the new verification and accountability program introduced by Emma. One of the earliest internal reviews focused on the provenance incident that had started everything. The investigation ultimately cleared the sommelier of intentional wrongdoing, concluding that he had relied on incomplete presentation materials rather than deliberately misleading investors. However, the review exposed significant weaknesses in Aurelia's verification procedures, reinforcing Emma's belief that the problem had never been a single employee. It had been the system itself. For years, Aurelia's culture had rewarded confidence, hierarchy, and authority. Employees had learned that challenging senior staff often carried consequences. Emma intended to change that. One by one, new systems were introduced. Anonymous reporting channels, documentation reviews, open feedback meetings, verification procedures that required concerns to be investigated regardless of who raised them. More than once, executives privately complained that the new process slowed things down. Emma always gave the same answer. A mistake takes minutes to make and years to repair. Gradually, the culture began to shift. Then came the moment that proved the changes were working. One busy Friday evening, a newly hired kitchen assistant noticed a discrepancy in a supplier's certification paperwork. Under the old system, he would have remained silent. The document had already been approved by senior staff. Questioning it would have felt risky. This time, he reported it. The concern was reviewed immediately. Within hours, the team discovered a documentation error that could have exposed Aurelia to significant legal and financial consequences. The problem was resolved before it reached a single guest. Watching from the mezzanine above the dining room, Emma felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Beside her, Grant looked down at the staff. A year ago, he admitted, I probably would have called that employee a problem. Emma glanced at him. And now? Grant smiled. Now I call him an asset. They stood together in comfortable silence. Below them, the restaurant moved with energy and purpose. Servers communicated freely. Managers listened. Employees who once felt invisible now understood that their voices mattered. For years, Emma believed her greatest victory would be reclaiming the recognition that had been taken from her. Standing there, she realized she had been chasing the wrong ending. Recognition mattered. Truth mattered. But neither compared to creating an environment where people no longer felt afraid to speak. Her question about a bottle of wine had cost her a job. It had also changed an entire culture. Looking across the restaurant, Emma finally understood something that had taken years to learn. The true value of integrity is not measured by who receives credit. It is measured by what becomes possible when people are willing to listen. Looking across the restaurant, Emma Carter knew she no longer needed the past to define her future. That was more than enough.